This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And the date is the 20th, and we'll be broadcasting you remote as usual. And I'll be talking about organization. But firstly, I want to say something about in passing. When I first came here, I was chaperoned and to a large extent brought here by Hadley Reed, who was in charge of agricultural communications. I didn't quite know where to send me when I lined up with the University of Illinois. I had been directed to go to the medical school to do illustration there, but since I had an agriculture degree, I ended up in Champaign. So I was with agricultural communications, and I did do art and some of those things that I would have done with the med school, which was fairly famous for doing audiovisual things. And I had wanted to take several levels of university in Australia. Usually there's a theoretical university, which is usually the older university. Then there's a technological university, which applies things more and has grown out of technical colleges, which were universal but fairly difficult because you would work and study at night, and those people were sought after, but they almost died out of a heart attack for the work that had to be done. So they created a university, and that was in most states. In New South Wales, it's the University of New South Wales. And then there were colleges. And I taught at Agricultural College, which now has become a Red Brick University. So this is where most of the agriculturalists came from. It's a tradition, and if you hunt around the Department of Agriculture, you will find people from this college. Tremendous tradition. When I came, Hadley Reed had an assistant named Helen Fry, and she was rather a wonderful woman and helped me get underway. She and Hadley would meet with me fairly regularly, and I with them, and we had lots of conversation. Helen grew up in Pennsylvania and married a gentleman named Fry, who was a scientist. And he came to the University of Illinois and was, unfortunately, he died fairly early. And so Helen was single, but very astute, and worked with Hadley Reed, and I really appreciated that. Helen passed this last week or so at the age of 98, and she had married again to a prominent farmer named Richard Ayres in the Bement area, and he was one of those farmers that would belong to the Extension Service and provide advice. So he and Hadley had associations for a long time. And so Helen's life changed, and she became a farmer's wife. And the Ayres family in Bement also owns a filter factory. And so she also became part of the filter factory. And she worked within the framework of being meant to develop the main street, which was, as most small towns were losing their stores and people were going by vehicle to supermarkets, and she established a store and a dress shop next door to it, and so she did a lot of helpful things in the Monticello area and was well known. And so we remember Helen Fry Ayres, and so she became the stepmother of a family of 4 or 5 children who I encounter fairly regularly. Jim Ayres, for instance, has been mayor of Monticello and is a prominent lawyer in Monticello. Steve is an advisor with the extension people and has a lot to do with extension. And I don't know the other members of the family, but this is a little bit of history associated with Champaign firstly, and then with Bement and Monticello. Bement's about 8 miles south of Monticello. And, I want today to do something about organization. I've been talking to people who end up going to Indiana, and they're amazed at the fact that the Covered Bridge Festival can stimulate tourists that are very interested in the Covered Bridge, the Wabash Valley, the history of the development of not only the Midwest, but that particular area. It's not unusual other places, but there's a constant wonder as to how this evolved and how it became that all the small roads are congested and people are walking everywhere and buying things. And we have to think about that because most of us have features that we want to promote. And so do you go for leadership? That this week, the Prairie State Conservation Coalition had a 1.5 hour seminar designed to encourage people who have the talent and the interest to become to assess their own character and see if they could perhaps add the additional weight of administration. The paperwork that goes with preservation and most not-for-profits is rather extensive, and so we're looking for those sort of people. You don't want to encourage people to do what they don't want to do. That doesn't work. But you do want people with a twinkle in their eye gets to be excited by achieving 2 or 3 things in a day that took a lot of get up and go to make successful. So we're looking for those people. And once we find some of them, we would like to let them know what it is that they would be working with. What is how do you define what they may have to do? It's always difficult to define, so it's handy to have someone come in with a webinar to tell us what the parameters are, so you don't get to be afraid of the unknown. Then the same seminar held a few weeks later is to let you know how you might take those tools and apply them to a real life situation. And we're thinking the same sort of thing. How does these little villages with a few houses get to put out the signs and put out sales benches and really get rewarded with people that come who were wonderful in that they are curious. They would like to know what you do and why you're here and what's your ethnic background and what makes your community tick. And often this happens by happenstance. Somebody puts out a tomato sales deck and somebody next door puts out fruit or vegetables. And it can happen without necessarily someone being a leader, but it does happen. And it does eventually sort out some of the people who are good at telling stories. It's very helpful to have someone who has a loud voice, perhaps a woman with ethnic dress or some character that makes the story work. And it may just be a few lines. It's usually not to people who are going to drive through the town. It's to people who have come to find out about you and your region. It gets to be that some of these towns have grown to the point where they're villages and then perhaps even a city. Then you start to add some professional people. If you go to a town like Columbus, it's rather a neat town. It's got a lot of buildings that have historic note. You are helped by experts that know the history of buildings. So a field trip with an expert is a very rewarding. The vernacular people are there too, and they usually pick up afterwards and make conversation, but it does help to have some organization and some infrastructure for running this. This coming week, a week ago, I had a friend who sent me a copy of a whole event, a month of at the Missouri Botanical Gardens. It was a celebration, a prairie celebration, and it was by dint of the virus, mainly a virtual field trip and games, prairie bingo. I'm not quite sure what that is, but an introduction of people to their prairies. They opened a photo contest, which opened at the start of the month and finished at the end of the month. And that was put up on the internet, and there were you could select your photographs, and there was a competition and some feedback from that. For instance, packages of seed were available. So in order to do that, you need an organization. One of the most famous ones is the TNC, the Nature Conservancy. It gets a lot of donations, and they can afford to have specialists who do research and specialists who do organizational work. The Audubon is in the same boat with specialty to birds, and the Sierra Club is similar, but with a specialty to the politics of preservation. And they all have enough generous donations to make it possible to employ people who specialists, but also fun people who can interpret sometimes difficult ecological relationships, or just to understand that you may be asked a fairly ignorant question, not knowing, and that's not a crime. That's you're curious and you're asking what you can do. I hear someone saying, the question is, can you ride a bicycle backwards? Well, that might be a kind of fun question. It's but people who do this sort of work have to be able to handle that sort of question. We have in our own area Grand Prairie Friends, which takes you to field trips. It holds annual meetings, which are informational, with a speaker that settles on some topic like mussels in the river, or cicadas in the prairie, or forest savanna woods, or buffaloes, or whatever. So they have been busy in Coles County. We have quite a few remnant prairies to be looked at here, and we hope that the Grand Prairie Friends will come back to East Central Illinois in Champaign and look at the prairie along the railroad line from Urbana to Danville. It's just a right of way, maybe 100 feet wide, maybe less than that. Sometimes it's more than that when there's a siding. But on that right of way is some of our only prairie remnant that is left. This is nothing to do with reconstruction prairies, which are quite helpful, and they give people an idea of what a prairie is like. But if you want to think about 110 broadleaf species and all the gazillion of bacteria and fungi and paramecians and whatever in the soil, then these are the only spots, and the state has managed to preserve just 0.01%. So we're, in this case, we're asking the Grand Prairie Friends to do that, what they were set up to do, and that was to advocate for prairie. It may be in the region between Paris and Arcola and Lovington and Decatur, or it may be from Rantoul to Paxton to Loder to Kankakee. It may be between Champaign and Bloomington, and there's a abandoned railroad between Bloomington and Farmer City and Mansfield that comes that far, and it will be worked on. But if it's too wide, it will take out that wonderful prairie that's on either side. So we're looking for how we might extend that corridor. The railroad from Mansfield into Champaign is active as a grain line. So it takes grain out to a north-south line, but doesn't need to go to Bloomington. And that's where the rail trail people get into the act. And unfortunately, recreation dominates over preservation. And so sometimes the trails are so wide that they take out a lot of the habitat, and then also they get mown on either side of that. And that is even more disappointing. So we have our own trusts, whether it be a land conservation trust, like in that works with the Sangamon River and acquires land. It has recently acquired something like 60 acres near to a rookery, and so we have local groups that care about. Well, even in the forest preserve or in the uh, conservation districts, there are people who spend their lives uh, saving little pieces of land, and most of the preserved territories in Illinois uh, have been done by people who have been private citizens or agencies. Not a lot of it has been acquired by the state. Right. The forest preserve is this week. I wrote a letter. At the moment, they have a very nice brochure, and they're asking for 1.6% rise in the tax base from the county, because over 75 years they've never asked for a rise in the tax base. And but for me, it is a beautiful brochure because it has a photograph across the top, which is prairie, and it's a good photograph of prairie, and it's our heritage. And there's a little symbol for the forestry people. It's got to be forest because if the forests were popular, uh, they were there for wood, so they were commercial, but there are also savannas that you could enjoy. And in some places, there were more in savannas. Some place like Brownford Woods has something like 13 different species. And their trunks are tall and thin because the trees have to extend to light. And so if you're a forester, you tend to harvest in those sorts of situations because the log that comes out will be free of low branches and knots and sometimes things like fence wire attached to them. So the little tree symbol was interesting because it has like a sheep wool type of cloud. Its branches branched everywhere, and this is a bouffant little tree, and it's obvious that it has to exist where there's a lot of light, so that those branches could go out here and everywhere. And it was not tall and thin; it was more squat, and it was nice to see that symbol in the corner of the prairie. So I wrote and said that to Sarah Lipsey, who is not only the CEO for Grand Prairie Friends, but she's also president of the Forest Preserve. And the Forest Preserve has this name, which we sometimes wonder if there should be a prairie preserve where you could be taken to a railroad line where by happenstance the railroad had railroad laws which prevented people from digging up that very rich prairie soil that has made us wealthy. So what would you take a prairie preserve too. Well, they're little pieces of line, remnant prairie, some of which we have at Rantoul and other places. So when people want seed, they walk the line. And there are little places near to Oakwood in Vermilion County where Doris Westphal used to harvest seed, and so other people did so too. And I really want the prairie advocates to be back in town looking at a road that parallels the mile where there's a lot of remnant prairie. I don't want to see it taken out by a wide trail. I would like to see this shortcut into Oakwood. It's not the 150 highway. It's a shortcut, and I figure that with a little bit of pizzazz, it could be a shared road. You wouldn't expect to drive down it at 70 mile an hour, but you could get there and use the corridor at 30 mile an hour or 45 mile an hour, and you wouldn't be exterminating a bicyclist or a hiker walking along that corridor. That's a very major change, and we're asking for that sort of change. So sometimes the groups that come to visit have advocacy in mind. It might be for a building or a forest or a place like Allerton Park, and often they're prepared to put their energy into helping and sometimes putting a hand in their pocket to make the effort possible. Sometimes that formal organization like a forest preserve or a conservation district or are funded well enough that they can put in trails that we could never put into a 30-acre preservation site. They can put in signs, and the safety is that that body of land is in perpetuity situation. It's going to be there forever. It doesn't matter who's on the board. The board is set up as a not-for-profit. It's more than a not-for-profit. It's a tax-based organization that will care for this site in perpetuity. So sometimes those agencies have a character of their own. And right now in Urbana, the Urbana Park District is illustrating how you can administer those sorts of groups and also get into controversy. First of all, they got rid of a whole bunch of geese, and then they have started to bulldoze some of the natural habitat that is around Crystal Lake Park. It's sort of created as an artificial lake with islands here and there, and there have been some big trees, and I've been on a number of bird walks where this sort of vegetation and trees are habitat for birds and so small animals also, and certainly the bacteria and the fungi in the soil. So then there's a question of who's doing this and who has permission to do this. And so I was watching a little film about this where people who are quite knowledgeable were presenting a case for wondering why we had to bulldoze this land. You have to know that this was originally bulldozed with horses and made into a lake. So it's not the first time that it's been modified, but it's a little shock to some people to see it being modified. And there's a question there. So even though you get involved with these sort of organizations, there's always some conflict or debate, but it's much better to have that debate out in the open, and that is the criticism to some extent that a banner is getting at the moment, because they are making dramatic moves that people don't know how to involve themselves in this sort of debate. Going to a more specific situation, I was talking to someone just now about goldenrod. At this time of the year, goldenrod is ubiquitous. If your field has been a cornfield and it's only 20 or 30 years away from being plowed, goldenrod will take hold, and you'll see acres of goldenrod at this time. And it's rather dramatic, and it goes along with boneset and other plants that are flowering late into the fall. So there is the debate that you need biodiversity, and that the goldenrod is so rich that it denies the biodiversity of the 100 broadleaf plants and the grasses that you want. So then you can pull up the rhizome of the goldenrod. It's easy to do at this time of the year because you can make sure you know what is goldenrod, because it has a very interesting flower on top. There are several goldenrods, as some of them are rather rare. This one is sometimes has the name of Canada goldenrod, but it's a common goldenrod, and you never have to plant it. It always comes in on the air. So if that field was planted to prairie, reconstruction prairie, and it had been cared for and mown and managed, then that would mean that the population of goldenrod would sort of automatically go down. It likes somewhat tender soil that's been disturbed, and as the soil hardens and as you plant other seed and it starts to grow and it has deep roots and is perennial and is about to survive, then the goldenrod will gradually disappear. If you want to encourage the process, you can weed it by taking out the roots, and you only have to grab hold of the fruiting bodies and just pull, and the rhizome will come. Sometimes that's not awfully helpful because the rhizomes can grow. So if you break the rhizome, then you're not doing yourself any good, because it may grow from the pieces. The other argument is that it's at least nature. It's at least green when it's green, and it's golden when it's golden. And that's better than having weeds. So it's known that a reconstruction prairie, for instance, is soft and often fertile, and that encourages farm weeds. So sometimes people are surprised when they've planted a prairie, and after 5 years they still don't have a very good prairie. It's got a lot of farm weeds in it, and aggressive prairie plants that know how to survive, like goldenrod. Yep. But you can have that sort of debate amongst friends and relatives, and it may take years to resolve. There are some people who are appalled at a prairie because it looks rugged. It doesn't obey rectilinear shapes. It's sometimes tall. It sometimes falls over. At the moment I walk around the detention pond on 2nd Street, and the big blue stem is falling over. and it falls over just like you've had a bunch of Skittles and you let them go and they fall in a circle. And for those who know big bluestem, that's wonderful. It's but for those who are used to a neat and tidy and manicured natural area or garden, then they would like to see that plant stay up. And people who mow are also annoyed by it. It's lying down on the lawn. Okay, so you may have to have stones and sticks and stakes that keep the prairie up, or stop the mowers from mowing down the plant. I watched yesterday as the mowers came, and I haven't seen our little pocket prairie in the detention pond yet, but I have been noticing an encroachment of the natural area, and part of it is that the people who are working with the mowers don't always know about the species that they're mowing around. There's one nice little circle on Park District ground that's in Scott Park, and there must have been a rather wonderful couple that with sort of PhD qualifications that put in a rain garden and has planted a very biodiverse embankments to the boneyard, and has allowed the boneyard to wander and meander in a natural fashion, so it doesn't have to do things like square bends. Well, I look at that with great joy because it's biodiverse. But the little plot as you walk onto Springfield Avenue was once planted to culver's root, and culver's root grows about 4 feet high, and it has these rather wonderful candelabra white plumes, and in amongst the culver's root there were some weeds, so I had the temerity to take out one or two weeds, and but then I came round the corner and the plot was denuded. So right now it has two milkweeds and it's bare. And in my responsibility to working with development, it's my responsibility to perhaps call up and say, hey, that culver's root plot was intentionally made so that you would see a prairie plant in its character. And could we have the culver's root back? And then you have to have someone who not only plants it, but looks after it to see that it doesn't get pulled up. These are perennial plants, and you pull them up by the roots. That's a cost as well as a disappointment. Around the corner a little bit, there was a plot with probably 80% bee balm, and that bee balm has fruiting bodies. They're like little knobs. We have silkscreen prints of those sorts of plants, and you can see the in wintertime, whenever all the leaves are off, you see these little knobs, which are the fruiting bodies, and there's a silhouette. Well, they've all been decapitated, and I have to wonder whether this is because the fruiting bodies aren't fresh flowers and aren't interesting, but they are interesting, tremendously interesting. I hope that the other alternative is that they've been harvested for seed, and then I would be pleased. But one has to stop long enough to commune with nature. Just this other day, I looked at a group of ducks, probably more ducks than you would want, but they're hybrid and mixed up. Some are white and some are black, and some are motley. And the Audubon people could pick out their origin. Uh, they're able to use the detention pond. It's kind of shallow, but they can. They have web feet and they can paddle in this area. But I saw a goose come, and the goose headed for the middle of that group of ducks, and I had to wonder what was going on in that goose's mind. And I think it was somewhat a power play by the goose to sort of disrupt the ducks that also use the pond. And then I saw other geese that were chasing each other. Usually they're in pairs. They marry for life, and they have sound. And you have to wonder, what is the language of these creatures? Can you simulate them? Sometimes you can, but we're actually thinking of making a bird, a kingfisher, a what would you call it? A pilot for the football team, a symbol. So then you have to think about what is this animal? What does it represent? It's very elegant. It's got a big bill, and it's got colors. And is this the sort of bird you want to have as a symbol? So as I walk the pond, I think about those sorts of creatures and how we use them. We got many, many geese because they like the ponds, and we have ponds everywhere. We have lawns, and they're excellent grazers. And I watch, and there's the birds are sitting in the middle of algae, which is there because there's runoff of excess fertilizer from lawns and the like, and farmland. And so this pond is rich, and I would look to see whether they were burrowing through the algae to look for the items underneath. And that made me wonder, is this pond stocked? And so it brings me to wonder about my father, who used to feed a kingfisher type bird. It's a kookaburra. And Martha, he called it, Martha would come and sit on his shoulder, and he had little pieces of steak that he would feed to Martha. And for years, Martha came and knew who Dad was. And I think sometimes I've gotten to know the geese well enough that they just don't move out of your way. They certainly don't chase you. But if you get between a nest and the rest of the family, you better watch out, because geese can be very dangerous. So as you look at the creatures and you watch three ducks all burrowing in the mud, and they get a worm in their mouth, and they waddle along and get to clear water, and they wash that grub and then eat it. And it's just interesting to think about the mind of that animal doing that. And some of these creatures have skills that we don't have. their eyes of a hawk or an eagle are often much more astute than our eyes. The sounds are interestingly. And we do have people who interpret the language. You get whales, and we're beginning to know how whales can speak to each other across considerable distances. And but then you could also figure out how those sounds are distorted by shipping. So it's you have to think about these things. So what I want to encourage is curiosity, and that's what all those people that are coming to the Covered Bridge event are doing. They're curious, and they're going to stay still long enough to see whether the heron gets a fish, or what is the behavior pattern. What can he do about Canada geese that used to go past us to southern Illinois, but the climate has changed, and so things are warming, so they're going further north, and they're discovering towns and villages and cities that have detention ponds that are they're very, very, very attractive to these birds. So if you're going to work in harmony with nature, then you have to know what their parameters are and what your ability is to create an infrastructure around them that not only encourages them, but prevents them from being overstocked. We as people ourselves are overstocked. We have millions of people in cities that are sitting on top of each other, and that's what worries the virus people, because it's very difficult to separate these people from the virus. And this is not going to be just one virus. We've had over the years a number of plagues, and this is just a first run. And so we as humans have to adapt to organisms that we don't understand. It is intriguing to understand. The Audubon Society has been wonderful because it takes rank amateur people and gradually converts them to people who make bird lists. Some people travel the world and they might have hundreds of bird lists listed, and it's a kind of a professional game to record. Other people are watching for the individual bird. It might be a pigeon that is resting quite satisfied in a chicken yard, and the rooster that's in charge of his flock is very upset by the pigeon, but the pigeon has a way of working with the cockerel, and it's just fun to do that. If you're going to raise chickens for food or eggs, then you can have a cage with wire or chicken wire around it, and a place for a broody hen to sit on eggs. You might want to make sure that she is in that sort of framework of mind, which allows you to know that she would sit on eggs long enough for the eggs to hatch. And so then you make sure that she gets good eggs, and then you wait, and the chickens arrive, and the cage is lifted up a little so that the chickens can go out on the surrounds. But you hear the voice of the mother, cluck, 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 and she's keeping her chickens informed. So if you grow up with cows and pigs and chickens and vegetable gardens, you get used to watching the procedures. You get used to knowing when the onion will be ripe, when the leek will be ripe, when the spring onions will arrive. And that's the talent of having a farm background. I listen to the people who do cooking, and they are past masters of knowing what this particular spice will do, what this particular bland food will do when you treat it fairly. And it is sometimes a career, but sometimes it's an avocation. And the bird people are in Busey Woods every Sunday with Audubon, and they're looking at triangulation. If there's a bird over here that's upset there, and you move over and there, and it's upset on another triangle, you can guess where the nest is, and you may even want to avoid it, or you may want to check it out so that you know whether that particular bird is breeding. Just wonderful little pieces of information that are helpful if we're going to provide preservation of some of our biodiversity, which is disappearing at a rapid rate. There are a lot of things to do with the overall nature of a savanna woods or an ecosystem, and sometimes it's very helpful if people get to know and understand that. So we have things like master gardeners, which help people to understand when not to plant tomatoes, and not until May do you plant your tomatoes. When to give up on your zucchinis. That sort of information. You don't have to invent the book. You study it, and so informational programs are very helpful. When we had a reading the landscape class at the Parkland College, we did a lot of general ecology. Gradually, it morphed into a artist in the landscape class at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, and we ran that in summer. The three of us teaching. Jim Zanzi would teach the photography and art of architectural buildings, and Lisa Stone would talk about secret societies and like the Oddfellows and the Modern Woodsman and that sort of thing that almost had a religious base. And I would talk about the geology and the biology and about the prairie. And that's informational stuff that we can do with. So if you're in doubt about your interests, it's not impossible to put forth the idea. It may just be two of you, maybe three or four or five, and you take out a not-for-profit organization, and it costs you $10 to do that. And then each year you have to say what you did and register as a not-for-profit corporation that has been active. In some cases, you can add a 501c3, which means that if a donation is made to you, then that donation is a tax-exempt donation. And that helps people to do what they want to do, because the finances necessary to grow those people like CEOs or administrative people, the historians, the people who have the knowledge that we don't have because we're not necessarily specialists. And so that is one of the questions that's being asked of Urbana at the moment. Is there a plan, and why is there a plan, and how is it being instigated, and how many years will it take to recoup its background? Part, I think, of the volume, part of the problem there is that there are not trails adjacent to the ponds. So in Champaign, the detention pond, the trails sort of follow the lake, and you don't have to climb onto an edge. And the creatures can be there without necessarily having to be on the walkway, but the walkway leaves so that you don't have to destroy the vegetation to get down to the water. There's a problem associated with feeding. If you have a zoo, there's a tremendous temptation to feed. So some people come and throw bread to the creatures, and that encourages them. And unknowingly, the people who are doing that feeding are encouraging the creatures, whether they be squirrels or geese or ducks, to depend on your generosity. But then you have the problem of overpopulation, and then the park district has to be bold enough to get rid of the excess animals, and then they have to be able to handle the complaints that come with that. I think we're getting nearer to the end, and I want to leave a little piece room for WAFT. It's working hard to do a virtual WebFest, so we don't have to have people in working together. And Ed Hadley and others are putting together visual material to go with this. They look like they're going to have a billboard that they can put advertising on, and then there's a question of where it might be. So there's a lot of activity around WEFT, even though the studio itself is almost vacant. And I want to say that this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And we also have to thank the Urbana Public Television for creating the opportunity for us to be here and working with WEFT and other community bodies. And I think they do an excellent job. I looked at a film of the Crystal Lake activities and found that to be informative, even though a little rough and tough. So thank you. This is Dave Monk.